Until you pay for it? Yeah.
Yeah, the I'm gonna sit back a little, kick my balls out of it.
Yeah, we'll slide this over.
That will grab us.
Yeah.
Good morning.
I'm sorry, ma'am. Oh, sir.
I could do something, but you know, I know how to read
It's doing great. Yeah, it's about full board. Wow. Front and center.
Good work. Yeah, that's fair. No ball spots. I didn't realize how bad I'd been getting until I saw this church shop. And there's this guy looked like one of the what do they call that guy? The beanie yarmulke guy. But I wasn't wearing the yarmulke, I was just wearing a ball spot. Right on the front row. And there I am, I'm going, is that me? Oh my God.
Clarity, huh?
Yeah.
Outside perspective.
Oh. The cameras are so harsh.
They really are.
Yes.
I do a lot of calls on Zoom, and it's an opportunity for a lot of visual feedback about myself every day. Some calls a day. It's like, wow. Yeah. It's good information.
Yeah. The National Academy of Trial Attorneys requires to do like 3 or 4 years of these acting lessons out in California, where you go out there and you're on the video, just like you're doing our show. And you put on your whole show and they critique it.
Wow.
And they record it though. And then they send it around to all their board, and then they critique it.
Yeah, wow.
Well, that's cool.
It's a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's about presence too. That makes sense.
Now you're trying to increase your saleability to 12 jurors, you know?
Right. Persuasion, likability, and all those good things.
Remember I was doing a murder issue out in East St. Louis, Illinois. And the juror let my guy off because she didn't like the tie of the prosecutor.
She didn't like the tie.
She didn't like the tie.
One thing, huh?
And it was the same stupid tie 3 weeks in a row. She said, I know he had the bean burrito because it was on his tie.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. I died laughing.
Every little bit makes a difference.
I'll take anything I can get.
Right, right.
We're going to get started in just a couple minutes.
That's right.
Awesome. All right. Very good. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you? My name is Sean Fallon. I'm here with the Clearing, and we're one of the folks that's helping to support this event. We're really excited to have everyone together today to talk about shared services and kind of the importance of shared services, especially in today's environment. Before I introduce our hosts, there are a couple of administrative announcements that I want to cover. First off, if you haven't discovered already, bathrooms are out by the elevator. Women's are to the left of the elevator, men's are to the right. We are expecting to get an emergency alert from the DC notification system today around 10 a.m. So be on the lookout for that. However, in the meantime, please silence your cell phones. And that emergency alert is just a test, just to clarify. Yeah, got to make sure. Yeah, because some people they're calling their wives, their kids. I love you, honey. No, it's not. No, just a test. But call them anyways and tell them that you love them. This is going to be a facilitated session, so I will be your MC and facilitator. So you'll see me with the microphone. We have folks who are coming in remotely on Zoom. So in order for them to hear, you need to speak into a microphone if you're speaking. So with that said, if you are standing up to answer a question or something like that, please wait for the microphone to reach you. And then finally, we got tons of breakfast. So eat up. As Terry was telling me that the interns will eat it if we don't eat it. So we've got to make sure that we fight them off. All right. Is that everything? Okay, perfect. All right. Well, then without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Terry Girton. She's the president of NAPA and our host for today.
Oh, wow. Applause, and I haven't said anything yet. So this is a great group. Let me welcome you to the National Academy of Public Administration. I don't know how many of you know about NAPA. I know some of you do, but maybe not all of you. We're a congressionally chartered, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. And we are specifically tasked to help government leaders at all levels make government work better. So we are thrilled to be hosting this series on shared services. It's a big part of how we hope to make government work better. We're glad that you all are here. If you'll notice on your seat, there's a little red card that gives you some information about the Academy. We invite you to check us out on the web. All of our reports are published there. And if within your own organizations you think that there's a way that the Academy can be helpful to you, we'd be happy to have that conversation. So I won't take up any more time. Thanks for your patience in getting started. I'm going to turn it over to John Marshall, the Shared Services Leadership Council.
Thank you, Terry, and welcome everybody. And I will also be very brief because we want to get right to the meat of the matter here momentarily. But I'm John Marshall, and I'm founder and CEO of the Shared Services Leadership Coalition. And we are an industry-supported nonprofit that advocates through educational and advocacy programs, acceleration of shared services in the government to improve government efficiency and effectiveness. We've been in business for, this is our 4th year, and this is the 3rd year that we hear a very successful breakfast series. And we're thrilled this year to have the Senior Executive Association and NAPA collaborate with us and help us extend our reach into a broader swath of the government executive community. So, and today we have two of our members, the Clearing and Accenture, who are helping to put together the design of this event and facilitate it. And we're delighted to have their support. And and thank you also for the strong support we've had from key people in the administration. We have Dustin Brown from OMB coming later to answer some questions about shared services as the President's management agenda addresses it. And also Dorsey Alfie and several of her colleagues from the Unified Shared Services Management Office in GSA, whose job is to oversee the execution and implementation of shared services through the government. So delighted to have them. We'll introduce them individually later in the program when we ask them to take the floor. So thanks again to you all being here, and big thank you to our friends Bill Valdez and the Senior Executive Association and Terry Burton and NAPA for their gracious hospitality today. It's delightful to have this facility to work with. So let me give it to Bill, and then we'll get right to our program.
Come on, clap for him. So my name is Bill Valdez. I'm the President of Senior Executive Association. And this meeting, series of seminars was actually born out of a conversation that we had with John Marshall and his folks a few months ago, where we said, where I said, I don't really get shared services. When I was at the Department of Energy, we had a couple of shared services initiatives imposed on us. And I can't say that my experience was great, with that kind of top-down approach on shared services. And so we engaged in a dialogue about, why my experience was bad. And we came to the conclusion that there were a number of myths associated with shared services. And primary among those myths is the absence of the voice of customers, meaning that, the general notion of shared services is that it's a top-down approach and that it's imposed on organizations versus an approach that in the private sector and other places where it's worked is informed by the voice of the customer. So we decided to hold these workshops to bust the myths and to show, to demonstrate that shared services can be an effective tool for agency reform and agency effectiveness and efficiency plans. So that's where this all came from. And so you today are the voice of the customer. That's what we hope to hear. And what your experiences are in terms of the shared services that you may have experienced or heard about, and then what you think might be the ways to overcome that kind of resistance. And then we're going to have 5 other of these kinds of workshops exploring specific areas of shared services, acquisition, fiscal accountability, the tools and those kinds of things. And so we hope you'll join us for those as well, because those will be very specific and focused on the actual implementation of shared services. The next one will be May 2nd. It will be on governance and what are the appropriate governance tools that you can use for shared services. So I hope to see you there. Just one final thing. How many people in the room are SEA members? Just raise your hand. Great to see you all here. Thank you very much. Look forward to your input on this, and we'll talk after the meeting. Sean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You can clap.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. All right. I'm hitting, but it's not advancing. Am I doing this right? Yeah, sorry. All right. So we, as our host and introduction mentioned, we do have a packed schedule today. So we've got some special guests coming later, but in preparation for that conversation, we want to lay some of the groundwork. We've got a few conversations that we think we need to have prior to really digging into that Q&A session at the end that are going to advance kind of our understanding and what we're here to do today. So I'm going to cover real quick the agenda coming soon.
Just cue me.
Okay, all right, so we'll go to the next slide then. That sounds good. All right, perfect. So we got started a few minutes late. There was a fire in the orange line, so we wanted to give people enough time to get here. Oh, perfect, it's working again. Great, thanks. We're going to start out with a conversation about the shared services mindset. A lot of people have the question, what is shared services? But we also have the question, is there a mindset that gets associated with shared services that makes things work more smoothly? We're gonna hear from Rowan Miranda and Accenture about some of the myths, the common myths on shared services, and then we're gonna get into that Q&A section. First, though, this is designed to be pretty interactive. So as soon as we dive into this content, you'll find that you'll be talking a lot. So it's important to introduce yourself to your neighbor. So can I ask everyone, if they haven't already, to introduce themselves to their neighbor just real quick? I imagine many of you guys already know each other. All right, awesome. Very good, very good. All right, I promise there's going to be more time to chat later, but it's good. Glad to hear that you guys are excited. Oh, am I in the blind spot over here? Okay, yeah, sure. So I'm glad to hear that there's so much buzz. There's going to be plenty of time to talk later, and also plenty of time to talk during the event. But good. Now you know your neighbor. So we'll get into it. I don't know. Awesome. So, like I mentioned, the shared services mindset is a little distinct from the question, what is shared services? Like Bill was saying, oftentimes when we talk about shared services, the first thing we think of is there's a top-down approach that's been imposed on an organization in some effort to, dare I say, consolidate or some other kind of wishy-washy word there. But the fact of the matter is that oftentimes when people think of shared services, their first inclination goes towards the services half of the title. They think, okay, let me start thinking about HR, let me start thinking about IT, let me start thinking about finance. And they oftentimes skip over that shared part. So part of the design of this seminar series, there's 5 or 6 of them. Part of it is designed to address some of those specific topic areas, but we want to take the opportunity now at this first kickoff one to talk a little bit about just the notion of shared or sharing. Because after all, we've been sharing, as humans, we've been sharing since the dawn of time. So it's nothing that's new to us. So the first question that I have for the group, and this again is just something that you want to talk with to the person next to you, is what's the last thing you shared? It could be anywhere. Maybe you shared an Uber ride here. Maybe you, I don't know, shared, notes in class or something like that. So just turn to the person next to you and answer the question, what's the last thing you shared?
And I shared the agenda with you, Sean.
That's right. getting feedback. Yeah, that one's off. This one, I'm getting feedback.
Take it out.
Can you turn this one off? I'm getting a little bit of feedback. All right, awesome. Very good. All right, could I have someone raise their hand and share with the group the last thing that they shared? Is there?
Breakfast.
Breakfast. All right, you shared breakfast. Can you say a little bit more about that? When you say you shared breakfast, what do you mean by that?
All right, when I came in, I introduced somebody to the puffs that had the ham and cheese in the puffs. Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right, got it, yeah. Perfect, okay, very good. Anyone else? What was the last thing that somebody else shared out there? Yes?
We were just talking and I said, I think the last thing I shared was the air, just breathing the air. We shared
We
shared the environment.
Okay, all right, sharing the environment, very good. Yes? You shared the metro. Very good, very good. Why do you share, why do you take the metro, or why share the metro? All right, so there's an element of cost. It's cost effective when you take the metro. All right, very good. Anybody else? All the way in the back.
I shared my colleague's frustration.
Ah, yes. All right, very good.
Yeah.
Ma'am?
I shared with my child last night. They need to do better on their homework.
Right, so you kind of like a knowledge transfer. Yeah, hoping to improve capabilities or capacity. Got it. Yeah. Yeah, or yeah, responsibility. Anybody else? Anything else that they want to point out that they shared? No? All right. Yes, sir.
Share the road.
Share the road. Absolutely. Absolutely. So when you think about sharing in your personal life, what are some of the reasons, or why do you share? So we heard, we're sharing food, we're sharing road or transportations, roads or transportation. We're sharing knowledge. We're sharing air, which I would call maybe a resource, right? So sharing resources. Why? What are some of the motivations for sharing? Why would we do that?
Convenience.
Convenience. All right, very good.
Receiving value.
Value. Yes. So access to value, convenience. What else?
Cost effectiveness.
It's cost effective. That's right. Cost effective. We heard that earlier. Is there?
To optimize resources.
Optimize resources.
I can spend my time doing something else.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You can sort of share the burden of the effort or the labor.
A capability that I could hopefully do on my own.
So you get access to something that you couldn't have done it by yourself, right?
To enable success of others.
Very good. Very good. And keep in mind, right? We're just talking about why we do it personally, right? We haven't dipped our toe into the water yet for federal shared service. Bill.
Promote harmony.
Promote harmony. That's right. That's right. Yeah. If you and I are sharing this, we can't be, stabbing each other around the side. Awesome. All right. So very good. Those are all great responses. What about the flip side of sharing? So oftentimes sharing is, if you think back to your playground days, it's how you're making friends, or it's how you're sort of cementing your status. What makes sharing hard? Yes.
Loss of control when there's a fire on the
There you go. That's right. That's a great, very timely example. So loss of control. What else?
I might not get what I want when I want it.
So it can occur that you got to sacrifice a little bit. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Someone may have had a contagious disease or virus or something.
Yeah. Sometimes they share something that you don't want. You say, "Wait a minute, I didn't ask for this, but I'm getting it anyways." That's okay. Excellent. Anything else? Oh yes.
Remember to keep
Yeah, I know. That's right. There's something over here.
Perceived loss of resources.
Perceived loss. So say more about that. Like in
Well, if you're sharing resources,
Right. It's like, hey, I've got 8 slices of pizza, and now I've got to give you one, but I want 8. Yep. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Sometimes you wish to share, but the other person may not be receptive to it.
So there's kind of like sharing one way, like, hey, you must take this. You must take my help on the homework. And it's like, no, I don't want the help. Yeah. Anybody else, any thoughts on why it might be hard to share? Yes, sir. So there's a fairness aspect to it. Yep.
The person you're sharing with may have a complete meltdown and cry until 8 o'clock at night.
There's always an emotional or human element to it. Yeah. Yep.
You want different things out of the sharing experience. For example, somebody wants pizza, but the other person wants to order burgers or Chinese.
Yeah, right. So there's like kind of the expectation management, making sure everybody's headed in the same direction.
And there's potential exposure of vulnerabilities when you're sharing as well.
That's right. That's right. You got to let people in sometimes. Very good. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Sharing is an element of compromise,
Uh-huh.
right? So you may want A, other person wants B, you end up with C.
Right. Absolutely. So this is all excellent stuff. And just not to go down this road, but just something to point out is, we've been practicing this this idea or notion of sharing since we were very young. So when we think about it in our personal lives, we almost don't even think about it. We just automatically are out there sharing and receiving, because we know that in order to achieve some of these things that we listed out, it's cost effective or it's convenient or it increases our ability to do something. We know that we've got to rely on someone else, and so we share. However, and this is where things can get they take a little bit of a turn. When you step into an organization such as the federal government and you think about sharing, suddenly there's a whole nother dynamic that gets placed on top of it. So that's one of the things that we really want to dive into today with our first question. So everybody on their chair should have a pen and a few index cards. So everybody hold up one index card, just in their hand. Perfect. Awesome. All right, very good. So in the upper left-hand corner, just write a big number 1. All right, and then my ask is, write a few bullets in response to the question up here. And the question is, in your role or from your perspective, what is a service or function within your domain you could see being shared with other organizations, and why? And this could be back office, so some of those administrative functions, HR, finance, IT. This could be mission related. Why? And then there's a bonus question. As you're thinking about the stuff in your domain that's worth sharing, think also too about some of the characteristics that make it worth sharing. So what are some of those tangible elements about it that make it a good candidate for sharing? And I'll give you about 60 seconds, 60 more seconds. No need to write full sentences, just bullets. All right, and then look up here when you're done, right? So I know who needs more time. A couple people still jotting stuff down. right, very good. Now, with the person next to you, and then the two people behind you, right? So you're looking for a group of 3 or 4. Go ahead and share your responses among each other. So maybe explain a little bit about what you do, and then talk about what services or functions within your domain might be worth sharing. Yeah. So you guys feel free to highlight Yes, right.
There are.
Yes.
If you think about it.
Well,
So this is the
all right, we're about halfway through, so make sure others have a chance to talk if they haven't already. All right, about another minute.
I think I'm going to have to move like this. I think he's going to turn me around every time.
All right, get that last thought out. And let's bring it back. Very good. Very good. All right, so a couple things that I want to say before we get into kind of the report out. One is, so I know I said this at the beginning and then quickly forgot about what I said, but we need to wait for the microphones. So, and that's on me. So again, when you're reporting out, please wait for the microphone to get to you, and I will try to remember that too. And then the second thing is we do have a few attendees on Zoom. So for those of you who are on Zoom right now, if you have responses to any of the questions that we're posing in the room, or any comments that you want to get into our conversation, just chat them in, use the chat function, and we'll be able to read them out into the room. All right, very good. All right, so the question was, what's a service or function in your domain that's worth sharing? And what are some of the characteristics, or why is that service or function potentially worth sharing with other organizations? And so you spend some time talking amongst your groups and reflecting individually about what that could be. So we want to go out now and hear what you had to say. So can anyone from any of the groups kind of offer up what you talked about? Yes.
Hi, I'm Laurie Ruderman with Program Support Center in Health and Human Services. I have a unique advantage in that we are doing shared services, and I've been in the industry for 10 years doing it. So some of the things that can be shared are things that have different surge volumes so that you can spread resources, things that you might not need a full FTE for, but you need a part of one, things that have administrative overhead that can be shared, resources like acquisitions, training, contact centers, financials, HR. But the main thing with sharing is it goes better if there's choice. If you force customers to come to it, they're going to look for every excuse to drag their feet. But if you build it and show cost effectiveness, they'll come voluntarily.
Yep. Thank you for that. Who else? What's something that you see in your domain or your function that's worth sharing?
Hi there, I'm over here hiding in the corner. This is Jason from SEA. We talked about knowledge and insights, and along with that, transparency, which helps the organization and individuals within the organization see the big picture collectively, so they can all see where they're going, as opposed to getting into situations when you're combating around equities.
Excellent, thank you. Anything else? Yes, ma'am, in the back. Microphone is coming your way, I remembered.
We talked about when there is a very standardized way of doing it, and that there's not an influence opportunity by a manager. So just one way of doing it throughout the government.
Yeah, so something that's highly standardized. Voluntold.
I might recommend, my experience is in the government financial management sector, and there's some functions that aren't necessarily inherently governmental, like in the realm of reporting or auditing. You can certainly find some efficiencies by shopping those types of requirements out. Sure.
And why is that? Why? Because it's not inherently governmental. What else about it? Is that the only reason why it's a good candidate?
It also can be scalable, so you can direct resources during the high season and scale back when those resources aren't required to that degree.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Sir? Here, take one. You gotta give it back.
I'm Howard Spira, the Chief Information Officer at the Export-Import Bank of the United States. And we'd like to, frankly, just share a lot of our IT with, I'll call it, I call them sister agencies that have some very similar characteristics. But to me, sharing is a little bit different than I would call outsourcing, where you're giving the problem to someone else versus we're trying to share the burden of a lot of requirements that are just hard to do as a small agency. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I don't want to steal anything from Rowan's presentation coming later, but he talks about kind of the two-way nature of shared services and how that's a key ingredient of having effective shared services. Who else? I saw another hand out there. Oh, yes, go for it.
So one of the ones that we talked about, when we talk about shared services in the government, we come back to four main pillars or towers, and it's always financial management, human resources, IT acquisitions, which can be challenging in any agency. And then when you try and share it, it becomes even more challenging. So I would encourage that you look at things that might fall outside of those domains and be a little bit easier. One of those would be something like mass transit benefits. Somebody said they took the Metro because the agency pays for it. Okay, do we need every agency and every bureau within an agency processing their own mass transit benefits? Or can we come up with one place that could do that? Because the transit is, the benefit is the benefit is the benefit. It doesn't change by agency. It doesn't change color. It doesn't do anything except get reimbursed on somebody's card. So there's a possibility. Another one that we've talked about in another group of roundtables is if you're in the intel industry, for example, what about sharing burn bag facilities? How many burn bag facilities do you have to eliminate your materials a certain way, and everybody has to do it pretty much the same way. Do you all have to have your own secret location to do that, or can you all share one secret location to do that? Things like that. So there are so many things if you just pull away from the four main towers and say, what else can we really share?
Yep.
Shuttle services. There's a lot of other things you can look at. And I just encourage that people be open to that and say, because those aren't going to give you nearly the battle that some of the main four towers will.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
Because at the end of the day, what you want is the success out of it.
Yes, right, chasing the outcome, absolutely. Very good, anybody else? Excellent, very good, all right, so we're gonna go on now to question number 2, and this one is probably easier to answer, because if you notice, in our first set of questions, it was really easy to be like, oh yeah, I shared this, I shared that, I mean, when I was putting these questions together, I was thinking about sharing in my life, and my dad never owned a weed whacker, but somehow I was always weed whacking, right? Because he's borrowing from the neighbor, so it's really easy, right? But then there are also some things that are hard. So with this question here, what makes, oh, it didn't go. Oh, there we go, sorry. What makes sharing services across government organizations hard? What are you unwilling to share, and why are you unwilling to share something, right? And so on your next note card, so a new note card, yep, forgot that instruction, my bad. So on a new note card, big 2 in the top corner, and then answering this question, what makes sharing services across government organizations hard? As you're writing, think about social norms, political wins, your operation system or model, technology systems, shared outcomes. All right, about 15 more seconds. All right, turn to that group that you were just with for the first question and share your responses.
You gotta have worries about you get the credit, you get the payment figure, jealousy about taking
We wanted to make the front share IT firewalls. Like put on our organizations, different things, so we try and share and we also see trying to take on too much too fast. Like so, HR services and trying to take on whole lots Yep, and then culture, they will drag their feet, kick their feet. I know, suffering. I don't share. My mission.
Nothing worse than saying something like today.
All right, about another minute. So make sure everyone's getting a chance to talk. All right, 15 seconds. So wrap up that last thought. All right, let's bring it back together. Let's bring it back together. All right, very good. All right, so the question was, what makes sharing across organizations hard? And what functions are you unwilling to share? Did I lose my microphone? Oh, there we go. Who's got yes?
My group came up with the idea of money is hard to share.
It is, actually. I agree.
I came up with intellectual property, not going to share. Premature transparency, for example, in a clinical trial. IT firewalls, and taking on too much too fast. Culture is difficult to deal with, and don't necessarily want to share things that are critical to my mission.
Excellent. Excellent. Awesome. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on the what we would not be willing to share. And I think if you look at what's the fundamental product of your agency, and anything that touches the fundamental elements of that product. Like I work for the Army, our product is trained and ready units.
Yep.
I'm not gonna the structure, the equipment. There's things that I'm a doctor and I'm not gonna share that. I'm not gonna have somebody else do that for me because it goes to the essential element of what my secretary is required by law to do.
Absolutely. A question for you. So how far, so like I hear you when you say it's like, hey, this is my mission, this is what I'm chartered to do, and I'm not gonna let anything get in the way of me doing that. How far does that boundary that you draw go? Does that, you know, from your perspective, is that something that touches, you know, it's like the old saying, how everybody matters in an office building, from the CEO to the janitor, you know, is that, like, can you articulate a little bit about how far you think that boundary goes?
Well, I think that's really the secret to good management and things like this, is what basic decisions do I need to, or basic actions do I need to keep, you know, within house, within the organization? And what are the things where I'm willing to take risk of allowing an outside person to handle for me?
Yeah.
And I think it's that being able to decide where that line is. And it's probably not going to be a bright line. It's going to be a big gray line.
That's right. There's this
that we're going to have to deal with
DNC
as we go through. So that I think is why they paid us the big bucks.
Right. Is it fair to say that while we would definitely look at how to do further shared services in civilian human resources, we would not look to share military personnel management across the services? Something like that might help people understand what the
like
boundaries are.
The three things you never mess with as soldiers is pay, mail, and chow.
Right. Those are important. Thank you for those contributions.
I just want to add another perspective here. So again, from XM, there's some other independent agencies that have incredibly similar missions. So we actually routinely, despite our congressional boundaries, we routinely shared intellectual property, routinely share ideas, and we'd happily share firewalls if Congress would allow us to combine like missions, because it's challenging enough to meet the missions with I'll call it the resources that we have. So I think there are lots of different I'll call it sharing spaces. The other thing that I also just like to throw out there is there's, like I said, there's different kinds of sharing. There's giving it to someone else. I suppose when I take the metro, I've really given it to someone else. But you know, I'm married. I share a house. I don't know if I consider that, you know, someone else the same way I consider it metro. So I think the perspective of who you're sharing with and sort of, I guess, what circle of inclusion you consider them in is another interesting aspect of sharing.
And what I'm hearing you say, Howard, is that you have some of these organizations that you maybe identify with closely. Say, hey, we are of the same ilk, and it might be easier to share with folks like that, as opposed to, hey, I'm a bank and you are a research institute, and we really don't have much in common, but here we are forced to share. Yeah.
So to the flip side of that, I think there is, especially in today's environment, a fear of going away, right? If I share too much, I lose my identity, and potentially there's that fear of obsolescence that can occur.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I think that's a good point. Anybody else want to add anything? Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. Our group actually came up with cost, customer service, and just strategic discriminator, meaning competition.
Yeah, competition. Yeah, a big thing. Thank you for that. Is there? Back there in the middle.
We talked about that tribalism
has a place in an organization where it creates a culture of unity. But that same culture also makes it hard to share across organizations. So we've benefited from looking internally, but that makes it very hard to share externally.
That's right. That's right. How can you, you have to have an identity in order to have an internal. Without having an identity, there is no internal. Yep, a conundrum. Anybody else want to say anything about what makes sharing hard? Yes, sir.
Especially with force sharing, and I know you're going to talk about this at another time, but it's the idea of I have to deal with a monopoly. And I have very little leverage.
Yep.
I can't go someplace else. And that makes transparency and things like that a lot more important, because since I can't go someplace else, I at least want to know, how come you're charging me this much money?
Right.
What's the basis? What's your cost basis?
Absolutely. Right. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, I think it's kind of unique that I think there's some resistance to sharing shared services across government agency, but yet we're open to allowing a contractor to come in and do that same service. Just because you have total control.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. What's up with that? Yes, ma'am.
There's a transition cost. So if you are consolidating dance pools or whatever it is, you want to hold on to your capital investment until you are sure that the new service provider can meet your needs. So there's some duplication of costs during transition.
Right, and it's there's a risk management.
And in times of declining budgets and severely budget pressures, does that really become the priority of the day in order to get the downstream benefits of it?
Thank you for that. Yes, here, Sean, you got mine.
My name's Sean too. We talked about the personal connection. Sometimes your service provider is someone who's in the building with you, in the desk next to you, down the hall, and when you move to shared service, you lose that proximity and that feeling of personal service and connection.
Absolutely. Yes.
I just want to add that I think that when you have a shared service, the other issue will become processing of these services, timelines, how quickly can they turn it around, what becomes a standard processing time for all of these services.
Awesome, thank you for that. In the interest of time, we got to move on to our final question. So pull out the last note card. There should be one more blank one, big 3 up in the corner. And then the question is, oh, I lost it again. I think this thing turns off, maybe.
Shared service.
Oh, there we go. All right. Yeah. What were we talking about? I totally blanked. Question 3. What are examples of great customer experiences, and what did you like or dislike about them? And I think this segues off of some of the conversation that we just started there with points brought out in the room. Considerations about going to someone else, and what do you need from them in regards to customer experiences? So this last question is going to be a lightning question. We'll give you about a minute to reflect.
Dispute resolution, we took it up through Justice did it from all the government agencies. So from Army and DOE, so we're a unit together, unified process across the all EDR, mediators, or EDR, many agencies, but anywhere else. That was when we picked
All right, and as soon as you're done writing, go ahead and turn to your group. Just talk a little bit about customer experience. Lightning round this go round, so maybe only another 90 seconds. All right, maybe another 30 seconds. All right, let's bring it in. All right, let's bring it in. And we want to hear from the crowd.
No, I'm not going to
All right. Who'd like to share this? This question's often a fun one because people get to vent about how much they hate Comcast, how much they hate SiriusXM, other organizations and service providers. It's really, this one is really cathartic often. All right, very good. So who'd like to share? Who'd like to share? Yes, sir.
I do.
Oh, hold on. Wait for the microphone. Sorry.
I have very little brand loyalty, but we just had a love fest over Southwest. It's because the prices are transparent. It's predictable. You're not going to get nickel and dime. They've used technology to make the customer experience really fast at the airport, and then you get free drink coupons every once in a while.
So in preparing for this session, Rowan and I had that exact same conversation about Southwest. We were saying, oh, we love Southwest. It's great. This is not an endorsement for Southwest, but it is an endorsement. Who else? Yeah, I know, that's right. Anybody? Yes, sir, in the back here.
So in terms of something that worked, or continues to work, payroll processing in the federal government. We went from dozens of individual payroll processing operations to about, I guess, 3 or 4 currently. And the reason it worked is there's really only one way to do federal and state tax deductions and FEHB deductions, and the rules are really clear, and it's really obvious if you screwed up or not, because every other week you get a paycheck or you don't get a paycheck. Your leave balances are right or they're not right.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so that's, and I think somebody had pointed out earlier in one of the earlier questions, highly standardized. That's an example of something that was highly standardized. Who else? Yes, ma'am.
So the TSP has been, I think, a really good example of a positive shared service across all of us. You kind of tags onto the payroll aspects, but I would say that's one of my few positives.
Your few positives.
Shared services.
So, anybody have any negative experiences that they? Yeah, we don't want to go. Well, if you like, we're open to both positive and negative. Anybody else? Who else? Somebody in the back? Ma'am?
So I'll just say that the elements or the attributes that we talked about as creating great customer experience where you get what you expect to get, not more, not less, and communication. So we talked about the example of a glitch in the payroll element that was what the problem was well communicated, the solution was well communicated, and while nobody's happy to have their W-2 hung up, the fact that it arrives as, you know, okay, we understand it's going to be held up a week, whatever, and here's where to get it. So when the communication is good, even problems are minimized and the customer can come away happy.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Right up here in front. One of the problems that I experienced was if you're not the largest elephant at the table in your shared services environment, and I was representing Marine Corps, and when you're in the DoD, Marine Corps is not the largest elephant, and I was having a problem with DLA and one of the services they provided, and I'm not going to go into the details, but it basically got down to the, sorry, we're not going to change because you only put this much money in the pot, and the other elephants put in a lot more money in the pot, so you're just going to have to deal with this loss. So that was a real problem, and the senior leadership had real issues with that too. Unfortunately, in the Department of Defense, it wasn't like we had an option. Sure, it was still a shared service.
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. So there's a perception that you can get kind of pushed around by the big dogs. Yep.
Yeah, I just want to add a comment we had here where a lot of times the argument, business case for shared services is cost. And I think there's an expectation, a false expectation, you immediately will start seeing those cost savings, and we talked a little bit about that here. I think there needs to be a lot of early communication and very pragmatic, clear communication on what's the real expectations are, and a cultural change. We went to shared services for human capital. I would say it is still evolving and hasn't done well because it was sold as seamless operations. You as the customer won't even see a difference. Oh yes, we saw a difference. So if they expect, they did not communicate very clearly what to expect at various phases and other issues. But yeah, definitely got to be clear on communications.
Absolutely, and one thing also, and maybe you guys will skewer me for this, but there's always the perception. There are really two perceptions, or maybe even three if you think about it. There's the perception that the customer has entering into an agreement with a shared service provider, and then there's the expectation that the provider has of entering into a shared service agreement with a customer. It's the old thinking. If everybody, somebody's looking for somebody that's tall, dark, and handsome, what are you bringing to the table too? You got to show up. So there's there's an element of kind of like both ways. It's a both way. Too much. We'll strike that for the record. Don't capture that one.
So when we talked about it, my first reaction was, I can't think of a great customer experience that I've had from shared services. And my teammate said, well, we've had some great ones, through financial services. When we dug a little bit deeper, it really got down to the big agency versus small agency kind of experience where, I came from a big agency where, it was imposed on us. It wasn't really evident what the benefits were, and customer service was greatly lacking. Versus a smaller agency where you have control over those kinds of factors, and this experience went much better.
Very good. All right, just one or two more comments so we can get on to the next part.
So just on the follow what Bill said is, a lot of times it's about the money. Mm-hmm. And somebody else mentioned, we have a shared service provider in the Pentagon for IT. They were given a small amount of money compared to what their mission was. So what they said they could do with the money and what our expectation was as customers were way out of whack. Mm-hmm. Because the savings got taken up right away, and they're just behind, and they're almost hopelessly behind because they're still trying to figure out how they're going to get it done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dennis.
I'd like to share a story from the FDA where somebody made a miracle happen. They needed a vaccine in one certain part of the country. FDA did all the paperwork, all the chasing, and the military delivered it the next day.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. That's a great success story. All right, last one. Just need you.
Actually, we're just doing another.
We mentioned a success story from small agencies, talked about customer service, timelines, and so forth, and making payments and the like. However, on the other side, though, we expect economies of scale, and we expect costs to stay reasonable, and sometimes we did not experience that. There have been some years have been an issue with rising costs all of a sudden that we did not expect.
All right, very good. Well, so in the interest of time, we're going to wrap up this portion of the event, and I'm going to hand it over in a second to Rowan. But just to kind of recap what we covered, we talked a little bit about sharing our personal lives and kind of recognize that we share all the time and have been from a very young age. And so it's I don't want to say it's easy, but it's normal in one part of our life or one aspect. But then you jump over the line into work or into the federal government, and suddenly things get a little wonky. Then we talked a little bit about, blanking on the first question. Hold on, let's see here. It's been so long. But we talked a little bit about what's worth sharing in your role. So what are some of the services or functions that you could share, and what are the characteristics of those? And then we talked about what makes it hard and what's a good customer experience when you do share. So thank you very much for your contributions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rowan. So Rowan, come on over. It does. Okay. Sometimes.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Feel free to stand up and stretch. I know you guys are all kind of squeezed in there, but I'm Rowan Miranda with Accenture Federal Services, and I've been with Accenture for, I'm trying to figure this out. With Accenture for about.
You want to try this one?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So I've been with Accenture for about 8 years and across 2 stints. Prior to Accenture, I was Chief Financial Officer at the University of Chicago, Deputy CFO at the University of Michigan, and then CFO in a city and county government. So most of my career, either as a consultant or as a practitioner like all of you, I've done work in restructuring operations. So I'm hoping to share some hard-fought lessons, okay, on some of those journeys. But my colleague Angie Graziano at Accenture runs our shared services practice. I'll let her introduce herself.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see some old friends in here in the back, too, shared service providers. Angie Graziano, had about 27 years with U.S. Department of the Interior. Loved it all. The last part of my career was as the Deputy Director for the Interior Business Center. Retired 3 years ago for a week and joined Accenture, and have been working in shared services primarily from the advisory capacity, helping those that want to move to shared services or those that are thinking about setting up shared services internally in their organizations. Really glad to be here today to share stories on both sides of the house.
Okay, see if you can get that one to work.
It's working.
Okay. Okay, so one of the topics is really administrative services, whether it's local government, state government, federal government, have certain characteristics, and it makes these services very inefficient, for quality. And some of the characteristics we've put out there that we see: complex manual processes. So even within a big federal agency, if you look at individual bureaus, their processes vary across bureaus, right? Another one is non-standard systems and infrastructure. I'll give you an example of one place where I did some work where they had 8 separate agencies within a big organization. Each had their own HR system, finance system, procurement system, and some of them were of different vendors. So you had PeopleSoft, you had GAC, you had JD Edwards, etc. And it's hard to implement shared services when you have 8 different types of financial systems or 8 different types of HR systems. Another one is too much time spent on transactional activities, too little time spent on analysis and reporting. Everybody talks about how they want to do more analysis and reporting, yet most of our clients are mired in transactional type of work or managing transactional type of work. Another pattern that we see in federal agencies is managers who are higher paid than staff doing, I'm going to quit this. Managers that are higher paid than staff doing very clerical work. Okay, so that's another pattern that we see.
Rebecca Patton, speaker.
Yeah. Functions tend to be staffed for people. Okay, functions tend to be.
Yes, I think he is.
I think you're.
Yeah. No, I think it's still. Okay.
Yeah, you're still.
Can I just talk? Shut this down. Well, we've got people on Zoom.
I don't know what's going on.
Yes, this could be that alarm that we talked about.
Here, try this. Okay, let me try it now. There we go. Do you think it matters if I stand there now?
You got to stand back there to be seen. See where the window is?
Yeah.
Stand behind the window.
Thank you.
Otherwise,
How about this? There we go. Okay, so just a number of, they're staffed to support peak demand periods. Organizations have widely ranging span of control. So often we'll see something as low as 1 manager for every 2 employees. Where in the private sector, we might see 1 for every 7 or 8, right, in the governmental setting. And also salary ranges are pretty inconsistent. We might see a salary range for an accounts payable person with similar duties, different titles, ranging from $75,000 to $135,000, okay, in this. Then the capacity for reporting analytics is very weak, and there are multiple versions of the truths running around the organization. And then control, risk, and compliance is weak also. So this is what we see generally in the government space, nothing unique to federal agencies. I don't know if you had any comments on this. No. Okay, our next is, if you could go to the next slide. So I was surprised by the definition of shared services when I got to the federal space, because it differs very much from what we see in commercial space. So when I started in November 2016, and by and large, when I saw the term shared services, it really meant one agency sharing the financial or HR system of another agency, right? What I didn't see a lot of was the sharing of operations. Okay, so there is some, I know Treasury Art, we've got Angie with IBC, there is some of that, but by and large, when the term shared services is used, we're seeing more of it in sharing of systems rather than sharing of transaction processing organizations. So most of what I'll talk about is really sharing of transaction processing, okay? And so if you look on the left side, you see the situation with many large federal agencies. You have individual units, and each of them have different finance, HR, payroll, procurement, IT processes. And that's what the left-hand side. You could have a project to standardize those processes so they look the same across the agency. So I know I've got somebody from Commerce here. So you could say, let's just take every bureau and have them standardize the process at the bureau level. That's what the item on the second chart looks like. That's the standardized. The third is the centralized model. So what you could say is, you know what, we're going to create a new entity, pull out everybody that's finance, everybody that's HR, and they move into this entity. And so that's what I call simple and militant centralization, and it doesn't work, right? There are many studies, like there was a study done of state governments where when they centralized IT, and essentially they pulled everything out of the DOT and human services, and they put it all together, an HR function or finance function, it was shown not only didn't it save money, it actually increased cost because the central monopoly erodes service, and then these people in the departments hire people again. I see a bunch of heads nodding. Yeah, so that's definitely not the model we're talking about. And then there's the shared service center model, which does involve some centralization, but it's the point made earlier by Bill. It has the voice of the customer that dominates. If it's done right, the voice of the customer should dominate how this organization is run. So there's a whole series of things you need to get right to have a optimally functioning shared service organization. It can't simply be pulling a bunch of people together and saying we're going to turn the switch on and call it shared services. And we'll get into some of those items in a second. And then outsourcing. Angie, you want to cover outsourcing? How it differs from shared services?
Sure. So outsourcing is normally just taking a look at some of the low-hanging fruit. Am I in the window? I want to make sure I'm in the window. Okay.
You are.
Taking a look at some of the low-hanging fruit that's primarily transaction-based. So it's looking at the transactional aspects of shared services. For example, in HR, it might be par processing and taking just that part of it. But inherently, there's a risk in taking some of the transactions when you're looking at something like HR or financial management, because in the government, these lines of business aren't ubiquitous. So a lot of times, the U.S. federal government, rightly so, will want to hold on to some of these aspects of the line of business that are inherently governmental. So it's very important if you outsource to private industry that you not only have service level agreements with your vendor, but you have operational level agreements with your partner in the federal government, so that in the case of HR, if something's given to a federal employee in the HR line of business, such as examining certificate of eligibles, you give them so many days to turn that around so that the vendor isn't held on the other side for missing SLAs. It's a really delicate dance because right now the government is not set up for outsourcing all of a transactional part of a line of business. So it has to be an honest, open conversation and a willingness to hold each other accountable, even when things aren't going well. And I really appreciated a comment that came earlier. We do need to do a better job of communicating. It's not all unicorns and roses when you move to shared services. There's a lot of upfront work, and that constant communication and talking about and forecasting what's happening on both sides is really important, because you're moving from the limo to the bus. And that's something you really have to get in your mindset before you rock and roll over to shared services.
Yeah, so just to summarize then this chart, really the work I've done typically involves setting up a brand new business. You know, in the example I'm going to give you next, it was called a business service center. Looking at every component of a department, let's call them bureaus in this case, I know those terms vary across federal agencies, deciding what function or activity is so commodity oriented that you can move it to this new business service center, and what is so strategic that it needs to stay local. So there's a real art and a science to figuring that out. It is never grabbing all of HR and grabbing all of finance and shoving it somewhere else. It really is a very nuanced process. So can we go to the next slide? So this is a project, Jesse, could you come on up? This is a project I worked on with Jesse here, okay? And it was at the MTA in New York. Jesse was the client. He's now with IBM. I believe I'm giving him this kind of exposure. Okay. So he was a client, great client. And what we did was we essentially, MTA was a large agency, but I'll let Jesse tell the story.
So it's funny, having worked for the MTA for 30 years, now I'm director of shared services, there are 4 places in America where every conversation has something to do with mass transit. Washington, New York, Chicago, San Francisco. Every meeting there's a talk about transit. So, and just as an aside, the MTA has more clients riding than any time since 1949. But here's a perfect analogy. There's a $30 billion capital budget, and it wasn't spent on the core process of 6 million people getting on a bus or a subway. It was spent on new subway line, new stuff that looked really sexy, that left behind all the basics. Anyway, so 8 agencies, the biggest transit company in the country, the smallest, the oldest, the newest. Bridges and Tunnels is the famous Robert Moses, organization where he got a car, which was his office, and he drove around New York, and when he met you, you got in the car with him. He drove, a car followed. When you got there, the car took you back. So talk about cultures that were all different. So we looked at all of these functions and said, what are the core pieces that should move to a service center? In 18 months, we took down from 8 agencies all of the HR and finance software programs that were being run, put up one standard PeopleSoft for all of them, standardize all the processes for AP, accounting, HR, finance, acquisition, etc., and lifted and shifted folks who were doing those jobs to a business service center. So I guess my takeaway is we can do way more than we think we can do, and it could be done in a way that satisfies both the customer and the business service center.
Thank you. And the outcomes, just to finish that up. So again, 8 agencies, each with your own HR, finance, procurement, IT. We assessed all those functions. We left IT out in the end, except for the PeopleSoft system that we consolidated to. IT, the MTA presidents were very concerned because it impacted their operations as opposed to just the back office. So we kind of took that off the table when we went to implement. But the outcomes, customer-focused business service center, done pretty rapidly the way governments go. Multiple systems into one system. And then the cost and FTE reductions, we're talking about a 35% cost reduction and a 30% FTE reduction from this. So it's kind of an excellent story. Costs were definitely a driver, but not the only driver. We're really focused on improving service as kind of the main way to mitigate some of the resistance to change, promising better service when we did this. Can I get the next slide? Okay, so now we've got a series of myths. These are my top 10, okay, and Angie's top 10, and we just wanted to, this really kind of shares our experience. So one of the things we hear about here is shared services equals centralization. And I like to really, and I've had a colleague of mine I was working with used to refer to it as, well, shared services is centralization on steroids, and it's not. Because centralization on steroids means it's even a more powerful monopoly than the normal monopoly, right? So, so the question is, shared services, in my opinion, doesn't equal centralization. Angie, I'm going to throw it to you on what are some of the reasons why not?
Because you can't just lift and shift an entire operation, whether you're moving to a federal shared service provider or you're outsourcing. You really have to be thoughtful about what's going on. And in the federal government, we've got these tricky things called labor unions. And so we can't really just automatically lift and shift people without proper consultation and thoughtful approach to being a federal employee. Having been one for 27 years, you know, we really take what we do very seriously, and we're very proud of what we do. Doesn't mean we're perfect all the time in the federal government. So you can't just centralize people and technology. A lot of times also the technology, in some cases in the federal government, has been a sunken cost because things haven't been modernized for years. And if you're moving to a federal shared service provider, a lot of the agencies that are moving budget 2 years out. And so, and I think we had someone mentioning about a cost spike going up. You have to be very thoughtful about your technology modernization, your technology consolidation, and then have a way of estimating costs, because when you're doing full cost recovery, you have to reconcile at the end of every fiscal year. And I see a lot of nodding heads. So that's why you just can't pick it up and pluck it someplace else and plug and play.
So the second one, and these two I want to discuss together. So the second one is the fear is service satisfaction will decline. I have a person right outside my office. They do my expense reports. And in the future, I have to send my receipts somewhere and somebody's going to do it. And then I have to deal with a call center to find out if my expense report was submitted. That's kind of the fear that service satisfaction will decline. It's a myth and it could be reality, right? We know that once you give up your people and you give up the responsibility, you may not get the service. So my point here is it could be a myth, it could be reality, but there are mechanisms you can put into place to get the service satisfaction to make sure it can't decline. And I'm gonna give it to you to talk about a couple of the mechanisms.
Yeah, so I guess the obvious one is really talking about SLAs, but in my opinion, SLAs really aren't enough. Because especially if you're talking G2G federal shared services, there's no way of really withholding payment, from one United States federal government agency to another U.S. government agency. That might work if you outsource to a vendor. You can withhold payment for performance from an SLA standpoint, but not so in G2G. So I looked to other things, and as I mentioned, I really loved working for the Interior Business Center. It used to be the National Business Center at IBC, and one of the great models we had in place in the HR line of business were these customer liaisons that actually got married to the customer during discovery and migration. And then when you went over into O&M, we had a team of people, and I was discussing this with a colleague of mine, we had a team of people that stayed married to that organization. So they had kind of, I hate to use one throat to choke because it sounds kind of aggressive, but I'll use it. One throat to choke, but also you build a trusting relationship over time. And that trusting relationship over time is really important when things go sour. It's really great to have a trusting relationship where everything's running shipshape, but when things break, and they do, that's when you need to be able to pick up the phone and forecast whether it's a cost increase, it's something with the technology, it's something with the workforce.
Great. Number 3, shared services is bad for the workforce. Who's heard that? Here.
No.
Nobody's
Okay.
heard that. What are some of the anxieties of the workforce? You're kind of living this with your workforce as they hear the word shared services. What are they worried about? Job security is one. What else? Job security is one.
Quality of work.
The quality of the work, absolutely, right? So today, you could have an employee that finds the work very interesting because they're doing 5 different things, or some people I'm one of them, likes to be the jack of all trades. Some people like to specialize. And we know shared services tends to lean more toward specialization, part of the angle. So one of the worries is you're going to take workers that are close to the mission today, and then you're going to move them to an enterprise service center. They're no longer close to the mission, and they'll find the work dehumanizing, factory-like, etc. So that's one of the worries. The truth is, okay, or it is a myth. I'll tell you what. So I've gone out and I've visited shared service centers, things that we didn't build and things that we did build, right? And so one example is I visited the Marriott Shared Service Center in Knoxville, Tennessee years ago. We used to take clients out there. That's a project Accenture worked on. And you walk around and you talk to the employees and they'll tell you the jobs are much more engaging. They have a diverse career ladder. They're not working, they have a career ladder for promotion. They're not working on one thing. They can actually do cross-training. They have a interacting set of practitioners around them. They're not by themselves in an agency. They learn from other people. So what you'll often find is that the workforce takes an accounts payable job and it provides them a career ladder that they typically wouldn't have in a single agency compared to when they work in the shared service center. So by and large, in the centers I've visited, the workforce tends to be pretty pleased in their new situation versus the current situation. There are issues related to salary, right? So the various, and those are very real, which is I'm getting paid $130,000 a year today, and the average salary in the service center is $100,000, and there's ways to deal with it. You could red circle the position, move them to the service center, you protect their salary, but then when they retire, you can bring someone in at the market rate. So there are things you could do to deal with that. Okay, the next one's a good one. Shared services, my agency is different. It can't address my unique needs.
It's also known as the special snowflake syndrome, the triple S. So there is some truth. Shared services are only effective when standards are in place. I really want to be forthright about that. We can get off the rails when people start to customize. We can get off the rails cost-wise. I see Doug there, my former cooperator there, we have to be very explicit with the customer when we move to a shared service that you are buying a shared service. So process standardization is critical. So is the technical infrastructure and the software that sits on that. However, there are always, and I've dealt with some of them, especially in the military side of the house, there are some special needs, some special configurations and functionalities, and shared services can accommodate those. But those requirements need to be caught way, way, way in the beginning, in discovery. Not when you've started kind of moving towards the ship and you're like, oh, wait a minute, I forgot to tell you I need this special report. Or I have, a wage mariner who, if someone gets sick on a boat, they get promoted, they get a salary increase just for the time that they're promoted to that position. You have to really know your customers, be able to ask questions and be very transparent about the requirements very, very early on. And then the shared service provider normally can accommodate that.
Next one, my agency can do it cheaper. I hear that a lot. Okay, and often when you actually go to look, you find there are costs that they just didn't capture. They didn't capture their facility costs because they might not have a line item in the budget for facility costs because it might be paid somewhere else. They didn't capture their energy costs. They didn't capture IT costs, right? So there are a number of, they don't capture sometimes benefits in state and local government. Benefits might not be budgeted at the agency level. They might be paid centrally, right? So those are the kind of things. And I've just found it very rare that when the agency does the study that, like I worked with the state government, they had 20 hubs doing accounts payable. And it was about 800 people doing it. When we moved that service to the shared service center, we didn't lay anybody off. The state government didn't lay anybody off. It was all done through attrition, early retirement, but it ended up being done with about 400 to 450 people. And so, I'd be suspicious about we can do it cheaper, right? The one about, well, we can control the service quality, that one's probably more likely because they can, but the cheaper one is a hard one to do by an agency itself. Okay, the next one, next slide. Shared services equals outsourcing. And here's the thing, right? So I could envision a federal shared service provider saying, you know what, we will outsource background checks. It's not a core. But by and large, in the shared services model, the model we're talking about is the bulk of the service being run by government employees. Okay, so to me, it's not outsourcing. There might be a piece that you actually outsource. So in the state government example I gave you, they had an ERP system. They had an impossible time keeping people with skills in that particular system. Like SAP skills are really hot. Workday skills are really hot. Accenture has a tough time hiring people fast enough in those skills. And government certainly is going to have a harder time than the commercial side, right? Because of pay scales and things. So there are instances when pieces of the function could be outsourced. That's not really core, or you have trouble keeping the skills, but by and large, in the shared service models, we're seeing it's really government employees doing the bulk of the work, as in the IBC case. Virtual shared services works. Here's another one. So I've talked to some federal clients who will say, we want to implement shared services, but we're going to do it virtually. Okay, what does that mean? That means today people are working in 12 different bureaus, and you know what? We'll create a new organization called Shared Services. They get to sit exactly where they are, and they just report into the new organization. And the only clients we've had do that is people that had to. So we had a client in Manhattan, not the one with Jesse, where it was just, they wanted to move to shared services. They didn't want to disrupt and move all the people at once. And they kind of used the virtual model. They didn't get as much of the savings, but it's a very hard one to pull off because at some point you've got to co-locate the workforce. You've got to train them as a team. You've got to manage them as a team. That doesn't mean remote work arrangements can't be done, but you first need to kind of bring the people together and create the organization. The situation of saying, today I report to Angie in a bureau. In the future, I report to shared services, but I sit right near Angie also. Now Angie doesn't control my time. Nobody from the service center is managing me. And somehow that model can work is really a pretty difficult one to pull off. So I would avoid virtual shared services unless you have to. And I could envision places where you have to, right? You could have a federal agency with teams in, Louisiana and Texas and Washington State. And then you decide you can't disrupt the lives of those people by forcing them to move. So there are elements of this. And then over time, you might hire people into one particular area. That's the place to do it. But if you can avoid it, I would avoid number 7. Okay, number 8. All responsibility is shifted to the shared service center. Want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, that's a big myth. I mean, we could take almost any line of business and cut it apart and talk about how that's not happening. But just let's take something that's happening right now in the federal government that's really been in the news a lot lately, and that's the restructuring of the federal workforce with a keen eye on reduction in the federal workforce overall in most of the civilian agencies. I know for a fact that right now, even coming from a federal shared service provider, there are certain things that stay back with the retaining organization. And those are things like retirements and benefits counseling. Those things are not normally outsourced to a federal shared service provider. And quite frankly, they really shouldn't be. There is something to be said about having institutional knowledge and a cultural edge on your employees and how folks move up through a system in a particular organization. However, there are certain components of each of the lines of business. Let's take acquisition or supply chain, for example. There are things that can be moved over into a shared service provider. In acquisitions, if you're not providing a full end-to-end life cycle acquisition line of business, you can outsource things like market research, contract closeout, certain components of the acquisition life cycle. So it doesn't mean everything is lifted and shifted.
Yeah, and which really moves us into number 9, right? So on number 9, really the work involves, you have to have a reason to move it. If you're not going to save money or improve the quality of service, don't do it. It's not worth the headache. It's not worth the anxiety of the workforce. So what we do usually with clients is we discuss all the functions in finance. Like in the MTA example, we had all of the HR experts and the finance experts and the IT and the procurement, and we discuss every function. Can you imagine it being provided by somebody else? Then we prioritize the functions. And then for shared services 1.0, you only move the most highest commodity functions. You don't move something strategic. You want to prove it with the highest commodity function. So in the Marriott example, I think this is years ago, I think they started with just travel expense. And then they did that well, then they built the confidence of the business, and the businesses kept coming and saying, here, take this next and take this next. That's what you want to create in this. So what I recommend to you is just do a surgical analysis and don't move things that aren't going to give you economies of scale or better service. In the university world, people were very protective of their web page. And so I used to hear statements like, if you move my web design for the School of Public Health, you know, I'm going to quit. Okay, that's how proprietary. And I was like, okay, God, we'll leave your web design, your web page design stuff alone. So just take the ones that are things like invoice payment. Finally, shared services has a beginning and an end, right? That is a myth. Once you establish shared services, your work has only begun. And I will give it to you to explain some of the work that's occurs.
I think one of the most important things that I'd like to underline again is that shared services is a partnership. It's a partnership between the provider and the customer. And there's an accountability aspect there, a truthfulness aspect there, and a large communication obligation. That never ends. If it ends, your service levels are going to tank. The other thing I would say, even if you successfully and just rocket through your migration and you get into sustainment or operations and maintenance on any line of business you move over, you still have to have an ongoing dialogue about cost, an ongoing dialogue about upgrades, an ongoing dialogue about new technology, an ongoing dialogue on through governance, how decisions are going to be made, how things are going to be funded. So it truly is a long-term marriage arrangement you're getting in if you're successful.
Yeah, and just to that point, once you establish shared services, normally it's important to establish a continuous improvement team. And the shared service center, even if it's run by all government employees, has to behave like an outsourcer in the sense of, boy, our client can fire us if we don't get our costs down. So we're in the outsourcing business in the commercial side, finance and accounting outsourcing. We don't have much of that, if any, on the federal side. I don't think anybody else does. Any of our competitors do either in finance and accounting. But in the commercial side, we'll sign these long-term contracts with companies. And what the company wants is every year their service satisfaction to increase and the cost to decrease. So we have to put teams together with our clients on how year after year we're going to drive down those costs and improve that service. That's in our contract. We have penalties if we don't do it. So similarly, the shared services that's captive, what I mean by captive is government employees are running it, they should be pressured to do the same thing, right? Year over year shows how you can improve cost and shows how you can improve quality. But I want to thank all of you for sitting in. Sorry about the technology problems at the beginning. Maybe technology shouldn't be a shared service.
All right, thank you for that. All right, we're gonna get into our next section, but before that, everybody just stand up and we'll give you 2 minutes to just sort of stretch, get the blood flowing, grab another Danish, but we're gonna get started again in about 2 minutes, so don't go far.
How did we do on time?
Perfect.
Thank you.
That was great. Yeah. We ran like 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I think between Dustin's 15 minutes plus 30.
Yeah, so good.
All in one.
All right, everybody come on in and grab a seat. Hey, Jason, how you doing? Good to see you. Yeah, of course. Happy to do this. Nice to hang out with you. Yeah, we've got some good all right, everybody grab a seat. So we'll get started. All right, almost got everybody. Terry's rounding people up. All right, awesome. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Our next section, we've got a special guest here, and I'm actually going to let Bill introduce our special guest.
Thank you, Sean. So our special guest is Dustin Brown, who is the Deputy Assistant Director for Management at OMB, and he was one of the authors of the President's Management Agenda, and he also was one of the strategic thinkers behind the cross-agency goal on delivering quality shared services, right? And so he's going to give an overview of the PMA and how how the shared services cross-agency goal fits within that framework. But I would just point out, that the title of this session is Shared Services Busting Myths Surrounding a Powerful Tool for Agency Reform. So this is not something that is sort of theoretical. Shared services are coming home to you soon, right? And they're going to come home to you in two different ways. One, through the implementation of the President's Management Agenda, but then second, through the agency reform plans, because it is a key element of the agency reform plans. And who better to address that subject than the gentleman who had significant contributions to the development of both the agency reform plan structure and the President's Management Agenda. Dustin?
Great, thanks, Bill. Morning, everybody. Morning. So great to be with you. It's also great to have a management agenda out that we can speak to. I will just say on maybe one note that I think this is the first time in the history of government that we have actually kind of leveraged the framework of a previous administration and continued that kind of in the setting of goals and metrics, milestones, leaders responsible for each of these goals, and an accountability process that we'll commit to. It was laid out originally in the GIPRA Modernization Act framework in 2010, and it actually kind of gives us now some continuity on the processes we use to focus on management and performance, which up until now, I think the theme has largely been throw out everything the last administration did and start anew, whether that was, reinventing government to the scorecards to, different approaches. And I do think, especially being at OMB and seeing kind of my colleagues on the budget side have a budget process that, at least in the executive branch, works pretty seamlessly. And then a regulatory process that similarly has a set of really clear kind of processes for getting decisions made and finalizing them. It is nice to have something like that kind of in the management and the performance space. So that is something that I'm quite pleased with, and heck, if it can survive the transition from Obama to Trump, it should be able to survive any transition, right? So I'm optimistic that this is going to be around to stay, and it's going to be kind of a used and useful tool kind of going forward, and maybe give us a little bit more stability in how we interact with making government more effective and efficient, both on cross-cutting things, but then really making sure that we also have the vertical kind of alignment down to the front lines. One of the neat things about this is we rolled it out in Kansas City rather than in DC, as a way of reminding us all that it's the front lines that really matter here, and we need to really invert the pyramid. So we're asking the question of what are we doing here in Washington to make their jobs easier and their jobs better. And so a lot of this really is meant to be kind of taken with that focus, which I know is hard to do, given the pressures and demands from a 24/7 news cycle, the policy, budget, comms, kind of that consumes us in Washington. But hopefully, if this is done right, it keeps us focused on those core outcomes and capabilities that our frontline kind of employees really need to have in place. So we really started with a fundamental question around, kind of the hard reality that trust in government is declining pretty significantly. And as we kind of looked at some of the root causes of that and some of the survey data kind of behind it, it was pretty clear. And there's a great Pew study that shows citizens think government has a significant role to play in a large number of issues affecting their lives. However, when you ask how well we're doing on those items, there's a pretty big gap there. And it varies. Some, it's a smaller gap. Others, it's a much bigger gap. But definitely kind of cause for concern in terms of we're not keeping up. And that was something that really came through loud and clear from the individuals we met with in Kansas City. One group in particular, a group of about 20 farmers, just talking about the one thing they want from government is their time back. They are running large, complex financial institutions, and the time it takes to drive to a field office and sign something versus being able to do electronic signature, which they've gotten used to in their financial and insurance worlds, is frustrating and is really not sustainable. So really kind of putting that customer right there in the center of this agenda is a big part of what we're trying to do. So there are a number of real root causes, whether those are structural issues like stovepiped kind of program structures or decision-making processes, leadership and culture. It's focused much more on compliance than outcomes, to really some of the core capabilities and competencies that we all agree need to be in place. And frankly, I mean, federal employees are giving us this feedback. This is not, and that was a big piece of, I think, what drove the focus areas you see in the President's management agenda. While on the one hand, we have 96% of employees reporting they're willing to put in additional effort to get the job done, which is almost a job requirement, right, for the type of work that we're doing. And 90% of people saying the work they do is important. We also have only 56% of people reporting that their managers encourage collaboration across work units to achieve a common objective, or 41% saying they can recruit people with the right skills, and about 31% saying that they can deal with people who are unwilling or unable to improve and deal with poor performers. So we're in this real challenging situation where we've got a very committed workforce to the mission, but we are not giving them the tools they need to succeed. And the gap is growing increasingly between what we experience in our private sector lives, Amazon and Uber, and then what we have both as federal employees in terms of capabilities and still relying on COBOL systems and things of that nature, or what customers experience when they interact with government. And that divide is growing, which I think explains a big part of some of the trust and satisfaction data that we're seeing. So the PMA really lays out 3 outcomes that really, I think, we can drive toward. One is around mission delivery and improvement. I mentioned earlier the consistency of the performance and management frameworks, the fact that all agencies updated their strategic plan on the same cycle for the first time in the history of federal government meant that we were able to also kind of have a much more kind of consistent planning exercise across all agencies rather than having it staggered and not aligned with the administration. So the fact that we have 285 right now outcomes that are comprehensive of the $4 trillion budget we have, and we have a bottom line that we can define and regularly ask ourselves how we're doing against, I think is a really important accomplishment as well that agencies should be very proud of, as well as about 87 specific leadership and focused implementation goals through the agency priority goal process. And we'll regularly every quarter give the public updates on how we're doing on those. So having that mission kind of right there in the center is a key component. Second is around service. I've talked about that already, but really making sure we're putting that customer kind of front and center as we think about the work government does and ways to kind of reduce burden, improve the quality of the services delivered, so that we're closing that gap. That is one of the CAP goals, is around improving the customer experience, which we're leading along with our USDS team. We kind of joke that my team, who does the performance, is like the US analog service, and they're the digital service. And the two of us combined maybe can actually kind of make a big difference here. And we're partnering up with VA, who's got an amazing customer experience team that's doing extraordinary work. And so it's a really neat partnership there. And then third is stewardship, and really how we make sure we're making most efficient use of taxpayer resources. And there's a goal, for instance, on making sure we get the payments right the first time. That's a good example of how we're moving out on that goal. So those three, mission, service, stewardship, really are those outcomes. The main kind of levers or drivers of change that Margaret Weichert in particular really came in and zeroed in on from her private sector experience, and just overall kind of what she's seen work in terms of change management, are one around IT modernization. I know that's been discussed somewhat here. The second is around data. She came in and asked a very simple but tough question: where is the U.S. federal government's data strategy? I had to admit we don't quite have one. She really views that as one of the biggest assets the federal government has. And we haven't done nearly enough to really kind of fully leverage that, either for internal decision making or to really help the private sector kind of get full advantage of the data we have to increase economic growth. And I've seen it even in OMB. We have kind of the data responsibility spread out across several different offices, and we're working to pull that group together on a regular basis to try to overcome some of the barriers that people have identified in sharing data, and making sure we're working through that. And then third is people, right? How do we get a workforce for the 21st century, whether that's hiring, whether that's firing, whether that's development, whether that's reskilling. There's a performance management, a lot of kind of need there, and great to have Dr. Jeff Pond confirmed as our new OPM director. I think that'll really help accelerate things on that front as well. Oh, well,
Just a little bit.
I'll hold it a little closer maybe too, that'll help. I haven't usually said that I need a mic, but I'll do my best here. So the final thing I'd say is one of the other points of emphasis of this is not just about kind of achieving some kind of quick wins, although those are certainly welcome. This is really about how we ensure long-term, kind of even multi-generational improvement. That's what's going to be needed to achieve these things. I think one of the benefits of having kind of a 4-year outlook, and in some places, like in the shared services goal, it's even going to be beyond 4 years, probably to a 10-year kind of strategic plan that we're going to be looking forward to putting in place, is that how do we get some plans here that can outlast the changes that are inevitable in leadership kind of transitions. And I think for a lot of these areas, these are not big controversial things that change dramatically kind of from one administration to the other, but can really still be impacted by kind of leadership transitions. And how do we get kind of the organization really to buy in to a set of reforms that can withstand the inevitable kind of leadership turnover that's going to happen. I really think that's one of the reasons why this is needed to be a whole of government effort. Just pivoting a little bit to the specific kind of development of the, I think we call it sharing quality service, cross-agency goal. I want to get that word quality in there, because I think one of the things we've heard loud and clear is shared services isn't a goal in and of itself, right? It is a means to an end, and it's appropriate in a lot of places, but we also need to make sure that the service is quality and cost-effective as we work to make it more broadly used. We heard this loud and clear from the President's Management Council. I was able to get the President's Management Council underway as early as April, actually one of the earliest that PMC has ever met, kind of since the beginning of the administration. Now, we didn't have a lot of confirmed deputy secretaries at that point, but we nonetheless got moving with our current acting deputy secretaries, and they brought this issue up to us as an area that is in great need of focus and reform. In large part, just the frustration of the costs and the quality that they're experiencing across the IT, procurement, financial management, HR space was very palpable. And you can see the frustration I know they had of the inability to make kind of progress and get to the service levels that they were expecting for their workforce. So that really is where a lot of this started in terms of focusing on kind of the strategies that you'll see laid out in the goal, whether that's areas where we need to be moving to more centralized services because they are highly standardized across federal agencies, or areas that really do require kind of each agency to mature because they are more unique. And so making sure that those strategies are reflective of the actual situation, not just kind of something plucked out of thin air and sound great maybe in a PowerPoint, but actually when it comes to reality aren't implementable. So that really is what drove a lot of the focus. And I'm really thrilled that we've got a great goal team established for this area. We have Emily Murphy, the administrator for GSA, Leslie Field, our acting administrator for federal procurement policy, and then we have our new federal CIO, Suzette Kent, who has tremendous amount of private sector experience in shared service delivery and is bringing that to bear on this goal. So that team is meeting regularly. Just met with them yesterday to kind of review where we are and the path forward. So I'm feeling really good about that. And we've got obviously teams of Beth Angerman and Karen Pico over at OMB who are continuing to plow ahead on this. So I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to be able to make some good progress and deliver both, hopefully, some nearer term wins, but really, maybe more importantly, put ourselves on a path going forward that is irreversible and really gives some certainty and clarity to federal agencies, but also to the private sector, and get to better, clearer standards that align with the private sector in a way that really makes sure that partnership's strong in terms of developing solutions, because I think that's obviously a big key of what we're trying to put in place. So let me pause there. I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions, unless there's anything else, Bill, you want me to make sure to cover?
No. I think people probably have questions for you.
Questions?
Oh, I have a question for you.
Okay.
I need a microphone. So this isn't on that page.
Yeah.
So, one of the things we've heard loud and clear is it's the customer experience, right? So in your plans for implementation of the quality shared services goal, do you have a way to educate about the customer experience and how to ensure that the voice of the customer is going to be there?
Yeah, that is a big piece of it. I think a lot of that comes down to a couple things. One is around governance and making sure you've got the customer at the table as these kind of decisions are being made. We do have a customer representative as part of a shared services governance board, and making sure that voice is represented, and including one from the HR community, from the financial management, from IT, so that we've got that front and center. I think the second thing I'd say after governance is around metrics and data. So one of the things that we've done, as you guys have probably seen, is a benchmarking survey that's been in place for the last 3 years. So finally, we're getting data on the actual level of satisfaction from managers on the quality and the costs of a variety of different services. And that's been underway for a few years now to finally, give us not just at the department, but even down to the component level, so you can look at, if you're DHS, how much it does vary between ICE, CBP, and FEMA. And it's not perfect, but it is a starting point of getting some feedback on the quality of the services that managers are experiencing. And we chose to go ahead and publicly release that data with the President's Management Agenda. So you may have seen that already out, but we have a chart there that shows the kind of level of satisfaction from agency managers' perspectives on each of those different functional areas with the service area. And I think we want to continue to drill into that. Hopefully you guys have been able to kind of access even more detailed data at the component level, which we haven't publicly released yet, but maybe someday we will. And I think that'll be a key part of making sure we're regularly getting that feedback loop into leadership and management so that we better understand where the opportunities are in terms of people doing things really well, as well as where we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
So my question is, how or when are we going to address, when we talk about the third item here is the workforce, how are we going to address hiring reform so that we can hire the next generation? Because they're not going to do it the way previous government servants have. And until we get that change, we're never going to be able to catch up on hiring to be able to meet mission.
Yep.
How are we going to do that and when are we going to address it?
How long do we have? I'm very passionate about this, as people like Annalisa back there know. I think we got to address it all of the above. We got to look for legislative reforms, which we're doing. We got to look for regulatory changes that can simplify the process. And, frankly, we got to look at our own internal kind of processes and how we use technology to overcome, frankly, some of the gaps that I see, whether it's just knowledge, frankly, of our HR staff. I mean, I'll just put that out there in terms of, I know it is not equal. Some are very good at advising hiring managers on strategies they can use to get to a quality pool. Some are not. How many people here have heard of quality ranking factors, just as an example, right? You put those in, it really can make a difference. But if you don't have an HR expert that's helping advise you on when to use those, you can really be in a tough situation when you get your cert list. And so those are the types of things that we're looking at on the legislative front. We have asked the Hill to include a number of provisions that I think would make a difference, ranging from direct hire authority for interns, all interns, which DoD now has, and we're trying to get it expanded to all federal agencies. So that is under consideration. Actually, I'm pleased to see that Senator Langford has introduced legislation kind of through his committee that would help further that. We're working on category rating legislation, which, not to get too nerdy on us, but I think could make a big difference in terms of really making sure that quality is a factor in helping select the right candidate, as well as a number of others, like giving more authority for term limited positions. To your point, federal service is going to look different going forward. We're not going to be hiring people who are interested in spending 30 years in the same agency. We need people that come in and out of the private sector more, and we need hiring authorities and tools that do a better job of reflecting that. I've seen us be pretty forward-leaning on direct hire in particular when agencies have come in with a strong business case, and I think OPM is committed to that as well. So I'd encourage folks to continue to lean on that front. And then finally, we got a little project. I don't know if I can talk about this yet, Annalisa, but I'm going to. With OPM that really is going to try to provide better technology tools that bring the HR and the manager together. I always hear this saying of, well, we need to get the hiring managers more engaged in the process, but that most of the tools are actually kind of facing the HR professionals versus actually designed for a manager who's going through the position announcement or job announcement or the selection process. So we've been working with a great team over at OPM, Diana Saxman, and Annalisa has been our subject matter expert on it. Annalisa, I keep referencing so many raves, so everyone knows who I'm talking about. On a tool that would be part of USA Staffing that could help bridge that gap between the manager and HR and actually put the manager a little bit more in the driver's seat of getting all the way through an announcement, as well as navigating things that previously have been done on email into an actual authoritative source of information that take down some of the complexity that I think often exists and get to one version of the truth of where your position announcement is in the process. So that's, I think, very exciting because I do think technology can be used to leapfrog and make some big process improvements. So anyway, I'm happy to follow up some more, but yes, very committed. Yeah, John.
Dustin, the CAP goal implementation plan for shared quality services identifies 3 buckets of services.
Yeah.
I think they're called common services, shared services, and centralized services.
Yep.
It's not very clear what you mean by those.
Yeah.
You or maybe Dorsey or Annalisa, some of your other USSM colleagues are here, could elaborate on that, tell us a little more. And how would you define them? What are some more examples? And how would you see them addressed, either through the PMA or through agency implementation plans?
Yeah, of course. No, it's a great question. And I think that is a big piece of the evolution we've tried to take. I think in the past, there's been a kind of almost bumper sticker, like shared services are good, and move to them. And it kind of doesn't reflect the reality that not all services are created equal, and that there are some that are standard enough that really lend themselves to sharing or maybe even centralizing, and others where it's going to take a lot longer because of unique agency situations. So really getting that level of detail at the service level, and not just HR, but really breaking down within HR, within IT, within financial management, at that level of detail to help inform our strategy is a lot of what we've been working on over the last year. I kind of think about it really as a business case almost that we're trying to develop, almost for each of those kind of different service management areas. So I don't know if one of the team members wants to, yeah, go for it. Give a walk through it with some examples, that'd be great.
Hi, so just to add on to what Dustin was saying, we've been listening a lot to all of you over the past few years, both in industry and at agencies, kind of in the programs, on the mission side and on the mission support side, to really understand your needs. And with this strategy, we're hoping to address it. One of the main things that we heard was that you need choice and different levels of service. And that it's not a one-size-fits-all model, right? The agencies, there are special snowflakes, and that's okay. Right, and let's figure out how we can address them. But maybe we don't need to have 108 different special snowflakes for time and attendance systems. There aren't even 108 agencies right out there, or at least cabinet level agencies. So we can do better there. And so really here we have different models in terms of, some people are just looking for services. They're having trouble hiring, which hopefully will get addressed through some of the hiring reform. But right now they're having some struggles, and they just want people. They just did a system modernization. They're okay. Right, you can do that. Or maybe you just want the system because maybe you have the people, but you want some modern technology. And so we've been looking at smarter technology. As a lot of you have experienced, probably you can do a lot in your private lives you can't do at work, like stuff on your phone, right? Maybe in terms of proven time or things like that. So we're also looking to modernize technology and offer that alone. And then there's also some people, like the gentleman who was here earlier, perhaps from the Export-Import Bank, who are looking for everything. Right, they're saying we're small, we don't have the resources, kind of we want to come, right, and get everything from you. So we're also, that also is being offered. And beneath all of that, because this was talked about earlier, and I think it's really important, is that there's competition, right, and options. And so we know that we can still share, right, and still have that limited competition. And so we want to make sure that there's different, contract vehicles underneath, with the different ways kind of that things are being done to make sure that the unique agency needs are being addressed.
And do you maybe just one example in each of the three categories to kind of follow up on John's point?
Sure. So in terms of, I guess going back to the three big buckets. So in terms of centralized services, for example, with the exception of DoD, all payments are made out of Treasury right now, right? And OPM does retirement processing, right? So that kind of falls in that centralized bucket. There's one way to do it kind of for the whole government. It's in their agency's mission, right? And they're doing it. In terms of then we're going to go to the other extreme, right? Which is, I'm good with my people, but I really like some helps kind of with the contract side of things, right? This ties a lot with it. There's a different category management kind of goal as well. And so we're looking, we're working closely with the category management folks. I think a lot of the systems kind of contracts, for example, in IT, kind of, will be done through that method. And then lastly, in terms of shared services, people were talking earlier about payroll, right, as a great example, in terms of both the processing and the systems kind of being done by a few agencies on behalf of the rest of the government.
Great, thanks. I know we only have a few more minutes, but yeah.
So one of the questions that or concerns or observations we made is, as much as we want to get the hiring part done, if we don't get the clearance process fixed, we're struggling with having such a long process to get through that by the time they actually get through it, they take a job elsewhere.
Yeah.
And we have to go and redo the hiring process over again. So that is
Yeah. And which agency are you with?
I'd rather not.
That's right.
I don't have permission.
It doesn't matter because I think everybody here is in the same boat. So it's not unique to any one agency, so it almost doesn't matter. But again, how long do you have? I am as frustrated about where we are as anybody. I've been working on this for far too long now, and we're just not seeing the progress that we need to. So the one thing I can assure everybody is this issue really is on leadership's radar, much more so than it had been. And I think we're poised to make some pretty aggressive moves here shortly. But it won't be as quickly as you want. Right now, it's frankly a pretty big function of just a lack of private sector capabilities here and contract capabilities. We lost about 50% of OPM's capacity when the USIS organization went out of business, and that has just not really, that created the big kind of backlog, and we're finally just getting back up to the levels of capacity that we once had. That's not the only issue, but it's most of kind of what created the backlog. And so we're working through kind of strategies within BIB and DoD colleagues in particular. Yeah.
IT modernization and agency transformation can be costly. And at a time of declining budgets, agencies who want to modernize sometimes lack the funds they need to do that transition. And while there is a return on investment, we're not really budgeted for a multi-year transition. How are we going to overcome that?
Well, I'm quite pleased that we do have a bit of a pilot program in place with the ITMF. Hopefully most folks are aware of that. It did get funded. I think about $100 million in the omnibus. So that's not enough to solve the kind of backlog, if you will, or opportunities for IT modernization projects. But I do think it's a great chance to prove a concept and basically find ways of innovative financing strategies that can overcome some of the limitations that we traditionally see through the appropriations process, which obviously doesn't always kind of support kind of upfront investments that are designed for kind of longer term return on investment. So, I don't know if there's a much higher priority that the OMB management team has than getting that right. And there's a tremendous amount of interest from the White House and OMB and all the agency chief information officers on really making sure that's successful, because I think it's something that could scale going forward. I'd also just note that there's also some authorities we're continuing to work through in terms of at the agency level, leveraging your working capital fund process to kind of mimic some of the things that we're trying to do on the broader kind of ITMF front. So happy to follow up. But I do think that is a pretty big piece of it. But we're also looking at hiring flexibilities that are needed to make sure you guys can recruit the kind of IT and digital service experts that are going to be needed to support the transformation. So be on the lookout for some of that as well in the near future. Do we have time for one more?
One more.
All right.
I just have a real quick question. One is with the transition to the Office of Shared Solutions and Performance Improvement, that was USSM and OEC being kind of rolled together. Can you guys talk a little bit about the decision to do that, what that does in terms of the future, but also I'd like to touch just real briefly on the SMO, the Service Management Organization. It's in the rollout, but not a lot of definition. So thank you very much.
So on the first point, I think the biggest opportunity we saw there is to make sure we're not reinforcing our own stovepipes as we work with agencies. I think having an ability to have a more cross-cutting kind of set of capabilities that help work through the issues as they come up, rather than just kind of reinforcing a performance silo or a IT silo or a procurement silo. One of the things that Margaret has talked a lot about is the gears you may have seen on the President's Management Agenda is the intersection points of those gears that we're most interested in. The intersection between IT and people, for instance, is where we want to be spending our time, not just in the IT lane or the people lane. So I think the kind of decision to merge those offices is kind of reflective of that and how we get a broader set of capabilities that deal with those intersection points, not just kind of each of the kind of silos that we'll still work on the silos too, don't worry. But I think we don't want to be limited to that. So I think that's great. And Beth Ingerman and Annalisa and the whole team have been really amazing to look at that broader pool of resources, including how we use our interagency council funds and capital funds, which are a big piece of that as well. And in terms of remind me a second question, sorry. Oh, the SMO. So I think we want to get the concept out, but recognized that the decision timeline for making those designations was one that we need to spend some time with and really make sure it's a conversation across the agency. So we weren't at a position to be, ready to make big announcements in terms of, which agencies would be which SMOs. But we felt like it was a pretty big hole kind of in the governance system across the enterprise that needed to be addressed. So we wanted to put that marker down. And I think that'll be a big area of focus in the coming months.
So I think one of the questions that go here for a lot of folks is that the SMO right now appears to be government only. I guess the question that most private sector folks are asking is there a role for the private sector as part of the service delivery?
I think it's a great point, and I'd love to follow up kind of on your ideas of how we could make sure that that's incorporated. I do think a big piece of it is, look, we need to get to standards. A big thing that's preventing us from doing what you're saying is we've got standards that are either not consistent or not aligned with the private sector. I'd highlight and commend OPM for their work. I think they did a nice job with their business reference model, actually getting human capital standards that are aligned with the private sector. And I think the financial management community and some others are kind of following suit. So that will be a big piece of what the SMO is charged with making sure is in place. And so I do think yes is the answer to your question. And I'd love to kind of follow up to get your thoughts on how we can make sure that's really hardwired.
I just want to add in one thing. Since this session was titled Myth Busting, I want to make sure new myths are not coming out of it. And so to answer your question, as Dustin was saying, yes, very much so. When we're talking about modernizing technology, for example, and having modern technology, right, we're looking to leverage that, right, from the commercial sector. And under the SMO, there's also help desk, right? There's PMOs, there's integration work that's happening. There's so many roles. And so I really highly encourage in the capital deck in the picture, at a high level, some of the roles of this more talked about, and we truly see that kind of as a partnership between government and industry, and also making sure that there's, when we're working with industry, one of the themes we've heard a lot today is about competition, right? And that's really important to us too. So there's not really, at least in the shared services space, but not really one, right, of anything, because we think the competition, kind of at all levels is really important.
And just a big shout out to this team over here. I think I really want you guys to think of them as your assistants for decision support as well. So as agencies are going through this process, they're really your group to consult with and can help advise on kind of the best path forward, no matter where you are in that kind of maturity model. Great. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, everybody. Before I hand it over to Bill to close us out, just a couple of small requests. One is those index cards that you filled out, we'd love to have them. So if you're okay with it, just go ahead and pass those down. You don't have to, it's optional. If you want to hang, if something incriminating on that index card, keep it with you. But go ahead and send those down to the end. We'd love to have them. And then the second thing is there's a survey on your seat. So like we talked about at the beginning, this is part of a series. So we're always looking to improve. So you can turn in your surveys. We'd love to have your feedback on that. Say that again? To May. Oh, yeah. The next series is to May, but I'm going to let Bill go ahead and talk about that. Yeah. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I'll be very brief because you've been very patient, very attentive audience. I just wanted to speak about the end goal of what we're trying to do here. We have a series of other breakfast seminars that we're going to have from between now and August 9th. All of those are leading toward a paper that we're going to prepare to OMB and to the shared services folks at GSA, sorry. I will also give it to GAO so they can begin the process of auditing you guys. But the idea is that we really want to get the voice of the customer. front and center on all of these discussions. And so the first step was, thinking about what are the myths. And after that, we're going to go into some of these big category functions and drill down into them to see where the touch points are and the ways that we can help make shared services a real tool for agency reform. The next session is on governance, and that session will look at what are sort of the overall governance rules that would make for a successful shared services project, and we hope you'll be able to join us on May 2nd. With that, I'll release you from your duty, but first give yourselves a big round of applause because you guys did a great job.
Thank you, everybody. And if you're interested in participating, more so than just as an audience member, come talk to Bill, myself, Terry, Tim in the back. We'd love to have you. Thank you, Sean.